For 15 years, I only played expert campaign and realism. I did touch versus in the early goings, but that was when the vast majority of players were casual and still figuring the game out. As mentioned briefly on this channel before, while I played Left 4 Dead's PvE game modes to relax, I was getting myself involved with esports titles to stress myself, mostly playing and watching League and Counter-Strike, while also playing Overwatch and Valorant. Then I worked with my college's esports department as a videographer during my time there, so I also saw the fundamentals of competitive titles like R6 Siege, Call of Duty, Smash Brothers, and some others as well. The point of me bringing this up is over time I've gotten used to the concepts that every PvP game has that define them separately, but most importantly, how they're all similar. Every game has their blend of strategy versus execution, macro versus micro, and the game of inches that both teams must play against each other. And after taking a deep understanding of these principles and grinding Left 4 Dead's hardest PvE game mode for 1.5k hours, it was time to put all the pieces together.
Wait.
Heads up!
Jockey!
Hello?
My expectation going into Versus was that things were going to be tense, and that if I made one mistake, then I would get vote kicked. When people talk about Versus, they usually talk about something along those lines and the toxicity. It's similar to the subreddits of other games I've played, and in my experiences, those were usually blown out of proportion. League, Counter-Strike, Overwatch, for example, do have examples of toxicity, there's no doubt. Maybe I'm just numb to it, but I don't see it every single game I play. Sometimes there's unlucky streaks, sure, but it's never been on the level that Reddit makes it out to be. And Left 4 Dead, I'm glad, is the same. Most of the games I played were really chill. There were examples of people saying just very, let's say, weird things, but I often never heard or saw anything overly negative towards anyone else. Perhaps I need to play more than 10 to 15 games. The main thing that would stand out is how often people leave, kind of similar to what you see in campaign, where everything is going very well for a couple chapters, and then after their first in-cap, they just leave. If you're going into a random versus lobby like I was, the people in Chapter 1 were never the same as the people in Chapter 5. Except for those that would leave after something went wrong, only to then later come back a couple chapters anyways, presumably because that game in between also had something go wrong. It's interesting to have a PvP game that actually allows no punishment for leaving like this. It shows just how often people leave when there's zero repercussion. But also disappointing because PvP game modes are supposed to have back and forths when they're at their best. To never even give things a chance to bounce back or to just leave the second things get tough isn't really in the spirit of what this game mode's trying to do, but I do suppose that I prefer that over them sticking around and being toxic in chat for however long we're stuck with them for. The pros and cons of this dynamic have to be that the expectations switch every chapter. Instead of having a lobby where one team beats the other every single round, people leave and basically reset the lobby to an extent, keeping things interesting, I guess. There's no official matchmaking in standard Left 4 Dead 2, so not just every lobby, but every chapter is a mixed bag, which in some ways is fine. I've mainly been interested in just playing versus, not so much winning or losing in the end. But in the rare instances we were having stretches of lobbies staying the same, it was always fun to go back and forth. But I suppose that's what Left 4 Dead 2 Center and Pug are for example, which I haven't touched yet, but I am excited to peek into, having experienced what Face It Counter-Strike is compared to matchmaking. Whenever the lobby was very obviously high level and everyone knew what they were doing, the survivors always got to the end. Weapons are simply just a much more reliable and consistent way to deal damage at multiple ranges. And understanding the game's patterns means that even the most coordinated of infected could only get so much damage off. So in many ways, playing Versus as the survivors was very similar to all of the co-op games I played, and points were decided by how much damage the infected were or were not able to get off without any expectation of a team wipe. Of course, the biggest survivor gameplay differences has to be that the infected may or may not be more coordinated than usual, there's 4 of them instead of 3, and ultimately they truly can flank you from any direction. In PvE, the specials usually only come from the front, with the flanks being more rare, but flanks are basically a given in Versus. If there's a rooftop or any elevated platform, you can bet that the specials will use it to some degree to try to get a drop on you, literally. When playing as the infected, there's a bit more of a learning curve. But ultimately, it was pretty clear to me that the ideal way to play goes something along like this. In my expert guide video, I mentioned that the infected are often not trying to team wipe you immediately, rather than trying to chip away at your health over time. The same applies to Versus. The 4 of you should be trying to coordinate your attacks in dedicated bursts to chip away at your enemies to get them to use their items. There are absolutely times where insta-kills are possible, but if that's not an option, then you'll need to play a much more team-oriented attack. I believe that communication is more important as the infected because it is on you guys to aggress and be proactive. Not only do the survivors always know that you are coming and to stick together, but your attacks do have sound cues that they can anticipate, and reacting in this game mode is, in my opinion, easier as opposed to initiating. If you are playing as the infected, you will have to understand not going in alone. There are so many times where I'm simply just waiting for teammates to respawn, and when a couple of people are dead, someone else just runs in by themselves and gets 0 damage down. This is just a disastrous way to lose rounds because if you die, the entire enemy team knows that they have a minimum of 20 seconds before you can do anything of value, and they can make progress on the map. A team is much happier taking on an onslaught of 3 specials than 4, and it only gets better with every time someone gets impatient and goes in on their own. I've seen too many lobbies where the survivors are able to basically speedrun the chapter because the infected just keep trickling in one by one. This results in a low quality game which doesn't really benefit anyone. No one is getting better by playing this. No one is experiencing the rush of a really good special infected fight. There are times, of course, where depending on who is ready to spawn, the survivor health economy, and where they are on the map, you can absolutely initiate a team fight when someone's still got 5 seconds left to respawn, and then they can respawn in and get in there quickly. So if you're the infected and you have all 4 people and you're ready to attack, how do you do that? Well, regardless of the game you're playing, a lot of times you will see that a team executing a bad game plan as one is still better than 4 individuals operating on their own. I've mentioned in the past about how traditionally the Charger is a great engage and the Boomer is a great follow-up. This is pretty true, but it's good to know that it doesn't always need to be that way. For example, a Smoker can pull someone closer to a ledge and then the Charger can push them off of it. A Boomer can divert a lot of time and attention by walking forward in a key choke point, not even vomiting, but just using the threat of the vomit, forcing the survivors to have to either change shoves over a long period of time or accept being exploded on, buying time for more infected to follow up. One of the first plays I ended up doing ever was pulling a survivor as a Smoker here, forcing the survivors to have to follow a fixed path to save him, meaning my team could then focus fire there and make them work for it. As I and newer players play this game mode more, they'll get a feel for what parts of the maps will cater to different combinations of special infected. But ultimately, so long as you're all on the same page, a series of 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10 trades will do your team much better than a single 8 out of 10 trade and then a bunch of 1, 2, or 3 out of 10 trades. Also, the survivors will always have to push into you. There are a lot of choke points and one-way points on every map where you can gain a significant advantage because the survivors will at some point have to walk into you. All of that being said, I feel like I have to stress the importance of the second person that goes in. Regardless of the form that it takes place, so long as the first 2 are able to cause chaos, it will open up options and allow the 3rd and 4th player in to do a lot of damage. But if the second person takes too long, then the survivors can focus on the first and turn attention to the second and your trade is hampered. How your follow-up executes can determine how much damage is being caused, but if the first 2 are shut down quite easily, then there's nothing that the 3rd and 4th can really do in the first place other than either move in and do minimal damage or try to back off and wait for the next assault. In League or Overwatch, you can often see teamfight initiators losing their life in exchange for causing enough disruption for their team to capitalize on. In Counter-Strike or Valorant, your entry fragger is gaining valuable information and hopefully trading off great damage in exchange for their life. In Left 4 Dead, you can always see the survivors, so information gathering isn't really a thing, but the concept of trading your life for a greater value of damage is universal, and Left 4 Dead is no different. I have 2 core examples here. One is where our jockey got an awesome pick onto a survivor, and as the hunter, my job was simply to cut off the guy making the run to make the save. Where I messed up, however, was I was positioned too closely to the jockey. In my head, I had it planned out so that as soon as he turns the corner, his gun would be facing the jockey, meaning that I could capitalize. But this approach made the timing very specific, and I missed that timing, I died, my teammate died, he got the save, and then actually later, they went on to get into the safe house. But if I, the second guy, got my timing better, I would have just cut off the savior before that room anyways, resulting in a double incap, and we probably would have won the round. To compare to another moment, here Nick went a bit too far from his team, so I got the smoke onto him. My allied Charger played this perfectly. He didn't wait for Nick's savior to be in eyesight of Nick to start charging, he contested them on their way over. Because of this, we actually got a nice team wipe. Unfortunately, every survivor left and we had to go back to a lobby after this, but this is just a good example. Communicating as the infected does not need to be an intricate thing. The best communication is short and to the point, without crowding up comms. People aren't stupid and don't need to be given a breakdown of how to play the game while they're playing. Simple things like I go in first or I follow you is enough for teammates to connect the dots and have confidence in what is happening. Especially in public versus games, saying I'll go first is probably the most voice comms that they've heard in 5 games that wasn't also saying slurs. Before looping back to playing as a survivor, I want to talk about the tank. When you play as the tank, there's an innate primal urge to return to monkey. You are playing as a big, strong, roided out beast, and the temptation to get in there and start causing havoc is very real. But you'll want to play it slower. If your teammates are dead, just wait for them to respawn. Let them cause some chaos first. If the survivors can all focus onto you, you're not going to be able to do much of anything, especially because your move speed is slowed down as you take damage. You won't be able to hit anyone, and if you do, it's not an instant incap, and you're going to have a bad time. The entire team should try to pilot the tank like a checkmate, not as a check. There's been no shortage of survivor tips from this channel. For versus, most of it carries over. Yes, you should always play off of your teammates. Yes, you should always leverage your weapon's bullet penetration. However, there are two glaring differences that must be addressed if you are going to take up the versus mantle. The first is that in campaign or realism, it's very easy to just turn your attention to a special infected on your teammate and not really worry about much else. But in versus, overcommitting to a teammate can mean that you can get blindsided. I would recommend that if you are not the teammate right next to someone getting pounced, ridden, or pulled, you should strongly consider keeping an eye out for the follow-up to try to shut that down instead and disrupt the infected's execution. Picture a jockey jumping on someone and everyone turns around to try to run towards that player, only to group up and give the enemy charger a juicy 3-man charge. That's what you can't have happen. But you may ask, where should I look for this follow-up? That's a good question and leads me to the second biggest difference. Infected can truly come from anywhere. From in front, behind, the side, usually above. Heck, I'm sure sometimes that they can come from beneath you. They can also spawn very close to you so long as they're behind a wall. This is probably the worst part about being a survivor in versus mode, and it will test your map knowledge and thinking of where you can be flanked from. So in turn, closing doors everywhere possible is also very strong. I do also want to reference my previous video, how to position in Left 4 Dead 2. A lot of that still holds up, but due to the amount of flanks in this game mode, there's a lot of covering you will have to do, transitioning from backline to frontline or vice versa, or just generally swapping positions with someone depending on what's going on. Also, I gotta say that I genuinely really understand the perspective of melee weapon enthusiasts much better now. Boomers are way more effective in versus, much harder to shut down, and even though being able to leverage the bullet pen and range of weapons in this game mode is still very strong, the reality is that the special infected are less telegraphed, harder to anticipate the exact when and wheres, and as a result, there are much more tight, close-range fights, since humans playing as the infected are much better at closing those gaps. The melees do an exceptional job here and provide so much flexibility for people to be able to cover each other during fights. Before wrapping up this video, I want to discuss gatekeeping, or kicking new players. In general, players should be given a chance to play and improve. Yes. That being said, you also gotta look at it this way. This game has been out for 15 years now, and there isn't a real tutorial or an instruction manual in-game. Tips, sure, but for the most part, similar to Counter-Strike, Valve dropped the game with tools and it was up to the player base to decide what the game flows and etiquette was going to be. The absolute bottom line is that players want a good quality game where both sides are working together. If you are repeatedly going in by yourself as the infected or straying away from everyone as the survivor, then you aren't doing anything of value for the lobby. The game quality isn't good. And sure, people can have patience and instruct you, but it's also well within the right of the team or lobbies to decide that they just want to play normal versus. I would not recommend that anyone just willy-nilly hop into a versus lobby unless they are able to consistently beat expert campaigns. The carryover knowledge and reflexes are very real, and simply it will be a bit of an uphill climb otherwise. Obviously, there's cases where someone might get kicked over something petty, even if they're playing good. Specifically, I remember a case where we got team wiped and it started with a guy splitting from us and getting pounced by a hunter during a tank fight. Our last man standing couldn't clutch it out, and then the guy who got pounced initially tried to kick the last guy for not clutching it. And yeah, I mean, that's your Genji trying to ult 1v6 and then blaming healers, or your laners getting solo killed at level 1 and blaming the jungler. This is a lot of my takeaways from this game mode, having just dipped my feet into it. It still feels like Left 4 Dead. I feel a bit silly taking this long to get into versus, and I was certainly overprepared, but I could tell that my teammates appreciated what I was able to bring to the lobbies even if we lost. For years, Left 4 Dead was more of my comfort game, while the other PvP games I played were my source of stress. But I'm glad that there was a very positive difference between expectations versus reality. I was expecting to get kicked a lot, I was expecting to get rolled, I was expecting to get trolled, I was expecting excessive toxicity, which is why I didn't stream this process, but all I got were chill lobbies, people leaving games, which is really only half a problem at worst, and I also got accused of hacking at some point because I managed to hit this shot. It's certainly something I can see myself streaming on top of my realism in campaign playthroughs. I was also happy to see the average level of sportsmanship where teams would ask if the other was ready, especially when waiting for new people to fill empty slots in the servers. Left 4 Dead, in my eyes, still reigns supreme, even 15 years later, but Valve, I beg of you, let's get this DDoSing thing figured out. It's cool that this is a fallback option, but public versus games mainly being hosted on someone's local server is really putting a lot of faith in that person not leaving. It is very possible that I simply just did not play enough games to see the absolute worst side of this game mode, which I have no doubt is there. I still very much have a block list because of people joining my lobbies and just trying to team kill people, and sometimes the actual date and time you play the game plays a factor too. I'm certainly interested in Pug and Left 4 Dead 2 Center, but it's also making me think more about scavenge and survival as things to try out. Maybe we can invest time in this channel to grinding out the remaining achievements that I still have managed to never get due to only playing standard realism and co-op all of these years, or now maybe I can do more deep dives into the roles and responsibilities of each special as I play more versus. So yeah, if you've made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments what your thoughts are on versus as well as my reflections of it. Please, by all means, let me know what parts of my initial impressions may end up aging poorly, or if I've managed to nail it down pretty well in this video. Thanks again all, and I will see you in the future with some more Left 4 Dead 2 content.